team, and if you have a Bible with you, would you go ahead and turn back to a passage of Scripture we looked at several weeks ago as we began this series called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. And I want us to go back and read all of Psalm 139 again today. We've been doing several weeks of studies on different pictures from the human body. And just as we look at the heavens and they declare the glory of God, I believe when we look at the human body, there are so many spiritual lessons to be learned of the pictures we see of God and His creation in our own human bodies. And indeed, the Bible uses the human body as an analogy in many ways and many places to apply certain truths to our spiritual life, looking at the human body and how God created us. And we started in 139 of the Psalms, and today my thoughts are going to center on the first four verses and then verses 22 and 23, but we'll read the whole passage together. What a fantastic passage it is. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before, and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the utmost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness will fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day, and the darkness and the light are both alike to you. For you formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. Now, listen to this next odd interjection. He's talking about how great God's thoughts are for him and how wonderful is God as his personal creator. And then he says, oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men, for they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Well, we're going to center in on the first four verses in 22 and 23 today, but let me just share an experience, maybe the essence of which you can identify with, maybe not the particular, but a couple of years ago I was sitting outside having coffee, and just early in the morning, just sitting there, and I felt something in my jaw, and instinctively just put my finger there, and there was a lump right in here, and I thought, what is that? My wisdom teeth are gone. I remember clearly when they left me, and I've got no more teeth coming in. What in the world is this lump down here in my jaw? And the more I thought about it, the more this anxiety, this fear began to get in my mind. Now, it was also about time for my 6-month dental checkup, which all of you should be faithful to do. And as I was thinking about this lump on my jaw, and I thought, well, I'm ready for my checkup. Maybe I'll wait a month. I didn't want to go and have that lump on my jaw. I didn't want it to be checked, not even by a dentist. Why not? And I put it off, and I put it off, and I thought it'll go away, and it didn't go away, and it seemed to get bigger, and those thoughts kept coming. Maybe you've guessed what they are. What if it's a tumor? And that dreaded word, cancer. I mean, that's a scary word, isn't it? That you hear that word and something within us recoils, and some of us have already faced that reality. Some of us have been through the treatments and the surgeries, and we've had loved ones who've been through it, and unfortunately, some of us have said goodbye to our loved ones because of that terrible disease, the C word, cancer, probably one of the scariest words in our vocabulary. And that's why I didn't want to go to the dentist. I didn't want the dentist to say, there's something here, you need to go see this one. And then that one would send me to this one, and then the other one. And somebody might use the C word. And emotionally, I just didn't want to face that, so I just did nothing. Except maybe a few weeks to months later, I lost a tooth because it was just an abscess. Could have been easily treated, and there was other things going on in there, but I didn't want to face it. Every year, and I hate this time of year because every year you get a call from your doctor and he says it's time for your annual physical, and I know I got to get on the scale and in front of somebody, and they write it down and see where I was last year, and then they want you to skip eating for a night and a morning and go sit and wait your turn and have the blood drawn, and they give you the paperwork to have it done, and once a year you do it for the insurance, and usually I'm not too nervous. You go, okay, they're going to bad cholesterol and triglycerides and good cholesterol. Who knows the difference? And you sit there thinking, they're going to tell me I can't have butter. They already took peanuts away from me. Now they're going to tell me I can't have butter and I got to have eggs without yolks. That's what you're thinking. But as I go down that paper I had to take to the blood test place, I noticed they checked a box. I hated when they checked that box, even though it's good for me. PSA. They're going to tell me how my PSA is. That's one of those tests that tell you if something's going on in your body. An infection can do it, but if you got a high PSA, they always look for that C word. And how we dread that. And when we hear somebody else has been diagnosed, our hearts either, we come to this place of we're grieving for them, or we're fearful for them, or we're nervous for them. And it's either grief or relief. When they get the biopsy back and they say, no, it was benign. And how blessed we are when we hear that word. I mean, did you ever think about it? Somebody's told you got a lump of something growing in you somewhere you're not supposed to have. We feel good because they say it's benign. At least it's not the C word. At least it's not cancer. And yet cancer is the number 2 killer in our country. 500,000 people will die in the United States this year of cancer. And here's what I want to talk about today. And I know it sounds like, he's off on this medical thing now. But as I thought about cancer, I learned many spiritual lessons. I got 3 of them. We're only going to cover one of them today. But probably one of the most important spiritual lessons you'll ever learn comes from an understanding of cancer. And that's what we want to look at today. This whole idea of if we are the body of Christ. Ask this question. Perhaps it's a strange question, but if our human bodies are fearfully and wonderfully made, and yet we can still get things like cancer, is it possible that our families can have a moral cancer in them? Is it possible that the church, that is the clear picture of the body of Christ, is it possible that there can be some spiritual cancers growing in the church? And we don't want to have to look at that or face that possibility. But unfortunately, the answer to those questions is yes. I wish I could stand before you and say, no, your family will never have a moral cancer destroying it. Or a local church will never have a spiritual cancer infesting it. I wish I wouldn't have to say yes to those possibilities, but because they are possibilities, we need to look at this thing. If we are the body of Christ, let's make sure we're healthy. If we are the body of Christ, let's make sure that this local assembly and anyone else who hears this teaching, all those local assemblies that we say, we want to make sure this body never gets cancer. And by the way, physical cancer, I know it's a terrible, terrible thing, and we've mentioned, some of us have lost people to it. Some struggle with it even now. Some of you are going through treatments. But I've seen God heal people of cancer too. Don't lose sight of that. I've seen people in this assembly who were diagnosed, you've got cancer. I think one of our elders was told, you got to have this done right away. And he said, can I wait a few days till I get to another place? He got to the other place. They did another time. Completely gone after receiving prayer. So I believe God can heal cancer. I believe He still does that today. So beyond physical cancer, I want to look at these other moral and spiritual cancers that can infest our families. and the church. But in order to do that, let's look at cancer and let's see what it is. And I'm going to give you, I know it's very, very basic and oversimplistic, and cancer is a very complex thing, and your body's a very complex thing, but just in real vague and general terms, I want you to get an idea. How do we define cancer? This is just introductory, but write it down. Cancer. It is the abnormal, out-of-control cell growth and development of cells that have damaged DNA. As one person put it, it's rebellious cells. It's cells that turn on and don't turn off when they're supposed to, but it's even more than that. We'll look at that next week. But basically, cells that are growing out of control, and it's not just out of control, it's abnormal growth, and it's because there's something damaged in the DNA of that cell. And so damaged DNA cells growing abnormally, out of control, call it rebellious cells. We used to think that they came from the tissues we already have. Now they believe it starts in stem cells, but either way, it's abnormal, out of control cell growth and development. But the key thing, remember, of damaged DNA. Now here's another word you probably haven't heard since your high school biology days. It is how a cell reproduces. It's a process called mitosis. I might use that word here and there, and I want you to know what I'm referring to. It is the process by which cells replicate, divide, and reproduce. And that's important you understand those words. Replicate. That means everything that is in the cell, you get a copy of it, an exact copy of, a replica of. For example, this is how cells reproduce. A cell has a nucleus. When it replicates, you now have two nucleuses, one just like the other. It has a whole ladder of DNA that also replicates. Now you have two DNA ladders or strains, and then the cell and all kinds of other things in there, and then the cell pinches off and divides. Now you got two that are just like the one. And then the two become 4 and 4, 8 and 16 and 32, and my math isn't that good, but you get the idea that the more time goes by, it just begins to mushroom in terms of the number. But what's the problem is if it has damaged DNA, then every cell that is reproduced also has that damaged DNA. If the first cell is out of control, then all the other cells will be out of control that come from that cell. That's what cancer comes from. So mitosis, it's a process that every cell in your body is supposed to be able to go through, and it's a normal, healthy thing unless the DNA is damaged. Mitosis. Here's another word you hear a lot about today, carcinogen. Carcinogen simply just means something that causes cancer, something that damages the DNA. And there's all kinds of carcinogens, and it seems like the medical field can't make up its mind what is and isn't on some of them. And you'll hear one study says this is a carcinogen, and then later you'll hear it's not a carcinogen. But basically there are things we know are carcinogens. They do cause damage that leads to this terrible thing called cancer. Radiation, too much radiation, whether it be from a medical machine or whether it be from the sun, too much radiation. Chemical things can cause cancer that are carcinogens. Biological things. You know, there's some viruses, not a lot, but there's some viruses that can cause cancer to get going in your body. Anything that can damage the DNA can cause cancer. For example, I just heard of a group in Asia, a group of people that basically they're really healthy. They have a real healthy lifestyle. They don't generally have any heart problems whatsoever, and yet they did some studies. They began to realize this group of people has an abnormal, large amount of stomach cancer. Why do they have stomach cancer? Well, they found out they don't have much refrigeration, so 2 times a day, 7 days a week, they're eating smoked fish, and they're thinking maybe there's a connection there. I know of one literal block where 8 people have died of cancer that live on that block. And now they're beginning to wonder, was it because it was built over a waste dump site? Could there be something environmentally that is damaging DNA? And then this whole thing begins. And we need to at least think about these things. Somebody said to me as I was having a Diet Coke. Well, I shouldn't have said Coke, a Diet Soda. And they saw I had a diet soda, and they said, Pastor, how do you feel when you hear that the sweetener in that diet soda causes cancer in lab rats? Well, I said, well, I'm glad I'm not a lab rat, because I like this soda. But then, well, maybe I should pay a little more attention. Carcinogens, things that cause cancer. Maybe they're from the environment. Maybe they're from biology, some virus. Some of them we can control. Stop smoking. They estimate that 198,000 people would survive every year if nobody smoked. Some of those things they're just well-founded. And so carcinogens, anything that can cause cancer. Here's a neat word. Write this word down, telomere. This isn't cancer. Some people confuse it, but telomere. I want you to picture something before I tell you what telomere is. Picture a shoelace. You got a picture of a shoelace in your head? A shoelace. What's on, and I know as we get older, we use less shoelaces, more slip-ons, more Velcro, less shoelaces, less bending over and getting back up. But shoelaces. What's on the end of your shoelace? Remember that little plastic thing around the end? So that when you go to put it through the hole, what is that, the eyelet or whatever of the shoe, it can get through there real easy. Well, what happens is you use that shoelace over and over and over again. What happens? That plastic on the end of it wears off, and the shoelace begins to get real frayed, and then you have trouble sticking it through the hole again, and then you put it in your mouth, and you wet it down, and you twist it, and then you get it at a little point, and you try and get it through the hole, and your wife is saying, you cheapskate, just go out and buy another pair of shoelaces. Because when that plastic thing on the end gets worn out and is gone, it begins to fray. Guess what? Your DNA is like that. Your DNA is like this long spindle of a ladder all twisted around. But on the end of it, there's this thing called telomere. It's this protective coating that keeps it together, that preserves the integrity of your DNA. And as time goes by, it gets a little shorter and a little shorter and a little shorter and a little shorter. And then before you know it, you're out of telomere. And your cells can't reproduce as well, and sometimes they stop reproducing, and there's a really highly technical term for this. It's called aging. It's called getting older. And there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. So don't look at somebody and say, man, you look really old. Just say, a little short on the telomere, aren't we? Because our cells are built to be able to reproduce, and it's the DNA that tells it how to reproduce. But when that starts to become all frayed and raveled, and then your skin isn't at 93 like it was at 23, no matter how you eat or what you do, it has to do with a shrinking telomere. Now that has to do with your DNA, but it's not cancer. It's just aging. I like what one author, he said, what is aging? What is old age? How old is old age? And he simply put it this way. He said, well, old age is when you've entered into a state of increasing fragility. What does that mean? Everything is more fragile. Things that never broke before, they break now. Things that were really hard to break before break really easily now. And once they break, things that repaired real quickly takes a lot longer to repair. And cells that would replenish in an abundance now are kind of scarce when they're getting replenished. Everything is more fragile. And that's the way life is. I like his illustration too. He said, with plastic surgery, sometimes you can't tell how old people are. They sometimes look younger than they are. Like me, they look younger than they probably are. And so how do you know? If you got two people, here's how he said you can tell. Two men walking down the street. One's real old, one's real young, and plastic surgery, you don't know which is which. Here's how you can tell. Both of them come to the same spot of ice. Both of them slip on the ice. Both of them fall to the concrete sidewalk. Both of them hit that sidewalk with the same impact. One of them, the very first thing one of them thinks is, I hope nobody saw me. And so they got up real quick or they'd be embarrassed. I hope nobody saw me. The other one is thinking, I hope somebody saw me because I can't get up. That's the old guy. That's the one who's entered into this increasing fragility. Why is that? There's a spiritual reason. Adam, the day you disobey, the day you eat of this fruit, Genesis 2:17, a process begins. Dying you shall die. That's literally what it says in the Hebrew. It says the day you eat it, you will die. But in the Hebrew, the linguistic, if you really break it down, it's a process. Dying you shall die. And we're all going through that, aren't we? We're all going through that. And when we're young, we don't think about it. When we're young, we don't think about cancer and we don't think about heart disease. And then we get a little older and we start thinking about stuff. Here's what I want to do today. Write this phrase down. I know it sounds awful termy and technique, but we're going to explain it. This is one of the most important spiritual lessons you can ever have. This is crucial. Write this phrase down: pre-cancer cells and the cell cycle. Let me explain that. Pre-cancer cells and the cell cycle. What I'm talking about today isn't cancer yet, but it is something that happens in order for there to be cancer later. And I'm concerned that there is not moral cancer in your life. I'm concerned that there's not spiritual cancer in our church. And yes, I'm also concerned about our physical bodies as well. But pre-cancer cells and the cell cycle. I mentioned mitosis, but you need something to understand. DNA in our bodies is very fragile. DNA is always getting damaged. When I said damaged DNA, I could tell many of us got kind of uptight. Oh, that's a horrible thing. That's a bad thing. Well, it is bad, but it happens all the time. Every day of your life, your DNA is getting damaged. But here's the really neat thing about how God created you. He put stuff in your bodies, proteins, enzymes, cells, all these things, genes. They're all in there, and many of them have one purpose in their existence: to repair damaged DNA. DNA is always being damaged, but the amazing thing about how God made us is it is always being repaired. Now, a couple of years ago, I was on my way to India, and the first leg of the trip was from here to L.A., and I hired a shuttle service to take me in, and I always tell them a time I want to be there. They say, "What time is your flight?" I say, "Well, this is the time I want to be there." They say, "What time is your flight?" "Well, this is the time I want to be there." I don't tell them the time of my flight, because I say, "Oh, you only need to be there 3 hours early." No, I need to be there 6 hours early. Because if something happens on the way, I won't be there 3 hours early. And I don't want some lady with her knitting and her sack lunch to be in front of me in line because she got there 6.5 hours early. There might only be one aisle seat left on that jumbo plane, and I want it, and I'm going to be there first. So I want to get there 6 hours early. So we're on this van. We're going into L.A., and I'm talking to the driver. We're having a good time. He was a believer. We're having some good fellowship. And as we were coming into Moreno Valley, I hear the thump, 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 and we blew a tire. And I thought, oh, no, I'm not going to get there 6 hours early. That lady with her knitting is going to beat me to the line. I'm not going to get an aisle seat. I'm going to sit in a middle seat for 20 hours between two people that take up too much space. And I'm starting to get uptight. And he pulls out his cell phone. He says, "Oh, I'll call AAA. I got AAA. I like AAA. I use AAA. But sometimes they don't get there for a half hour. I don't have a half hour." So he calls AAA. And no kidding, as soon as he put the phone down, clicked off or whatever the button was, he turned off his cell phone, a knock on the door. Right away, knock on the door. A van had pulled up behind us. He rolled down the electric window, and the guy says, "Hey, I see you got a flat tire. I'll fix it for you." You know who this guy was? He called himself a Good Samaritan. Some company, I don't know whether it's auto parts or gas station, but somebody hired this guy, and all he does is drive up and down Route 60 in some of those roads, and all he's doing is looking for somebody who's out of gas or broken down or has a flat tire, and he's right there to fix it. Man, I was glad for that guy, because I beat that lady with her knitting. I was the first one in line. But you know what? Inside your body, there are things that God has created, and all they do is drive up and down and all throughout your body, and they're looking for that damaged DNA, and they're looking for that flat tire, and they're looking for that out of gas, and they come up alongside and they repair. God has built into our bodies this incredible process whereby we can repair within. Now, in this cycle of mitosis, and just see it as a cycle, the cell starts to replicate inside itself, starts replicating things, then it starts to divide. It's a whole process, very complicated, but this is important. Get this now. At several points in that process, the cell is told to stop. The cell literally receives a signal from a protein or an enzyme or some other cell, and that cell receives a signal that even though it's in the midst of this mitosis, it receives a signal you're supposed to stop. Why? Because these repair elements in our body want to come alongside, and here's a phrase I want you to write down. They want to inspect and correct. There are things in your body that when our cells are in this mitosis process, this cell cycle of reproduction, they will stop that process and they will look into that cell. They can literally read the genetic code, and whatever's out of line, they fix it. Isn't that beautiful? That here you can have damage all the time, but God builds into you the ability to repair. And yet one of the most important things you can do in life is slow down and stop when God tells you to. Because we're always important and we're always in a hurry and we gotta do all these things. And yet there are times when God says, wait a minute, I have scheduled some stopping points in this whole cycle, and it is my purpose for you to stop so that there can be inspections and there can be corrections. You've got a gene in your body that just because of its weight, it's named after its weight, P53. I thought, what a lousy way to be named. I'm grateful I'm not named that way, but it's P53 is the name of this gene, and all it does is read and inspect damaged DNA and fix it. There's other things in your body. That's all they do but you've got to have, that cell has to stop. That process has to slow down to a stop in order for that to happen. It's like a NASCAR race. The goal of the NASCAR race is to get your car across the finish line as fast as you can in front of everybody else, but you got to have some pit stops in that race. If you don't have pit stops in that race, you're probably going to blow an engine. If you don't have pit stops in that race, your tires are going to wear too thin. You're either going to blow a tire or it's not going to get traction. You're going to spin out and crash. You will not win the race if you don't stop in the pit stops. No matter how fast your car is, and even though there's a desire that says, I've got to keep going, God says, no, you need to stop. Inspection, correction. Inspection, correction. Dr. Goodman, in his course on this, he teaches that there are certain things that accelerate growth, and sometimes they get stuck in the on mode, and there are other things that are to inhibit or at least suppress growth. There are certain signals that come that say to us, I'll slow down and stop now. And then when the repair is made, there's other things that signal it and say, okay, now get going again. But he put it this way, what if you're driving in your car and you're going 100 miles an hour and you look down and say, oh man, I'm going 100 miles an hour. I got to slow up. So you let off the gas pedal, but it stays down. It's stuck in acceleration mode. You got a problem. And then so you try to tap the brake thinking maybe you can slow yourself down, but when you tap the brake, it goes all the way to the floor. Your brakes are out. Now you're in an accelerated mode, and the things that are supposed to be stopping you are not working. And there's things in our body like that. When we develop cancer, things that are supposed to stop these cells aren't stopping them. And this whole process. And what happens to that scenario in the car when you're going 100 miles an hour and you can't slow down? You better hope you run out of gas. You better hope you blow a gasket head. You better hope that engine seizes up because it didn't have enough oil. You better hope something blows, or you're gonna be in for a terrible crash. And so is it in our bodies when our cells get reproducing. There are times when they just keep going when they should be stopping. And if they don't get stopped, they can cause all kinds of damage. By the way, there's an interesting thing that your cells do. It's called apoptosis. It might be up there somewhere. Apoptosis, apoptosis. And basically what apoptosis is, call it the suicide of a cell. Apoptosis is when these things come alongside and they look at that damaged DNA and they say, we can't fix this. So they send a message to that cell, and what that cell does, it initiates another process whereby it dies. It ends its own life because it's better to die than to replicate damaged DNA. And you know, there's certain things in our lives that just absolutely cannot be repaired, and those must go to the cross. Those are the areas in our life we need to die to ourselves. And here's where the analogy changes, because when we die to ourselves, Christ resurrects within us. And that's what keeps you healthy. Dying to what needs to be dead and having repaired what needs to be repaired so that you can live a fruitful, reproducing life. Now maybe you've already guessed where I'm going with this, but look at Psalm 139:1 again. It's stated as a fact, but then 23 turns it into a prayer. The psalmist says, search me, O God. And the word for search is chakar in Hebrew, and it means to penetrate. To get down into something, to examine it. It's like those other elements that try to get down into that cell and see what's going on with that DNA and fixing it. And so here David says, Lord, you have searched me. You've known me. You know when I sit down, when I get up, you even know the next word I'm going to say before I say it. But look at verse 23. Now it's a prayer. He asks God, search me. Know my heart. Penetrate my heart. Examine my heart. It means to penetrate, to examine intimately. It's used as spying out land or the earth being spied out or a forest being spied out. And he says, and see if there's anything in me that's twisted. See if there's anything in me that needs to be corrected. This inspection, correction.